I'd like to introduce Dr. Patricia Manuel, who is a retired professor at Dalhousie University, which is based in Nova Scotia, Canada. Dr. Manuel is a retired professor of planning at Dalhousie University with post-retirement appointments in the School of Planning and the Marine Affairs program. As a geographer and environmental planner with expertise in wetlands, watershed, coastal systems, and climate change adaptation, and many more things, Patricia supports communities in their efforts to ensure environmentally responsible land use and development. While working in coastal places, Patricia has also studied coastal access, including working with students and colleagues to build an inventory of publicly owned access around Nova Scotia's coast. An inventory is a necessary tool for protecting access in a province where coastal access is often taken for granted. And I'll turn it over to you, Patricia.
I'd like to thank everyone very much for the fantastic presentations so far. It's been incredibly informative and interesting and thought-provoking. And now I'd like to share a little bit from our perspective on the coastal access that we do have and how we are trying to understand it better and prepare an inventory of what we know we've got from a public coastal access point of view, that is on public land that is shore facing. And so we call this presentation Connecting the Shore, an Inventory of Public Coastal Access in Support of Coastal Protection, Advocacy, and Research in Nova Scotia. And I'm doing this work with Hannah Harrison and Nicolas Winkler, who you've already met, and a lot of students who we acknowledge on the slide at the end of the presentation. So we're going to cover just very briefly what the problem actually is, and I think we all pretty well share the same problem, it sounds like. For this particular initiative, I'm going to define the access. Again, just very briefly talk about coastal ownership in Nova Scotia, look at what we consider coastal access features for the purpose of this inventory, talk about how we're building the inventory and using it, and then how we hope to think about in moving forward with it. So Nova Scotia has a very long coastline. It's more than 13,000 kilometers when you take into account the entire peninsula, all the little islands, the many inlets and bays and estuaries, the island of Cape Breton, if you can see it up here, and this inland, it's called Bredor Lake, but it's really marine. It adds up to a lot. But within all of that 13,000 kilometers, publicly owned access is actually quite limited. The coastal access is not managed or assured in Nova Scotia. So what we do have is limited, and we do need to understand better the quality and quantity and distribution of this access, because understanding the access is really a first step to move us towards resilient coastal communities. Coastal communities resilient naturally for climate change, for culture and social and economic reasons. It's really important for the coastal communities of our province, and it sounds like this is a shared concern. So at the risk of sounding very lay in comparison to my co-fellows' coverage of this in the early part of the symposium, please excuse me, but we'll just take a quick review, and maybe for those who joined us later, this is some new information. So in Nova Scotia, who owns the coast? Well, below the high water mark, it's mostly the government, it's public land. And like I said, this is a summary. And above the high water mark, it's mostly individuals, corporations, nonprofits. It's private shoreland. And our current, the published figures around this, although perhaps our inventory will refine these figures, is that the private is about 86% and the government is about 14%. This 14% is what we're really kind of interested in at this point. It's the land that faces the shoreline. Excuse me, I'll just put that back again. It's the land that sits at the shoreline, property that has a shore boundary on the coast. And that is the land and the access that gets us to the public land here that is below the high water mark. So we have some public land that is coastal land, and then the rest of it is below the high water mark. So public access is at risk, and we've heard this so much already. So we're sharing really in Nova Scotia the same concerns that we've already heard from our other speakers. We know that there are development impacts, and in this instance, a seawall was built to protect a property, and you can see the rock wasn't either very effectively placed or it's now been falling away, and it begins to block actually the access that is in the publicly owned domain. Coastal climate change impacts are flooding and eroding access that is there, and that access is now being pushed further inland, and it butts up against private land, and then that engenders conflicts between land users, coastal land users, and private landowners. And then we have a lot of unmanaged access, even on the public lands that we do have. And that access can pose a risk because of behaviors that move into sensitive habitats, and there's also a user safety concern. So what is access? Well, we've already heard in other presentations, it's this ability of people to view and reach and move along the coast. For our purposes, we're looking at the reaching and moving part of it on land or water, from water to land, and from land to water. Excuse me, I just have to arrange something on my screen here. So what does then this public coastal access look like? So often it's just wild and unmanaged shoreline, and it can include promontories, bluffs, and beaches, many of which are quite similar, in fact, to the ones we've already seen in the presentation so far. Park shorelines, historic sites and lighthouses, roads and trails and paths and walkways, boardwalks, and these are along and to and above the shore, and wharves and docks and slipways, roadsides and road ends, and also urban and working waterfronts. We have in Nova Scotia 18 counties that comprise 49 municipalities, and all of these counties have coastlines. And so we are building this inventory county by county, and these red check marks just show the counties that we have completed more or less in depth in terms of what we're attempting to identify. But we've also got a handle, a first level, high level handle on what is the distribution of public and private land around the coastline of the Nova Scotia as a result of some recent work from last summer by a student intern with Ecology Action Center, and that would have been Antea Fleming. And you'll see some of her work later on in the presentation. Our work started in 2023. First, we developed an inventory methodology, and then we began building this inventory by mapping this public and coastal property. And this work has been undertaken by a number of students in different programs at Dalhousie University. And then we begin exploring the inventory by looking at projects that look at things like access equity and access quality, and the role of land trusts in providing public access to the shore. It's been developed from methods that were based on projects in South Africa and the states of Maine and Oregon. It is primarily a desktop mapping exercise to get started, and then we ground truth what we find. We've been using ArcProGIS. We use open source and subscription databases provided through government and non-governmental organizations. That provides us with topographic and environmental, recreation, and property ownership information. We update that with satellite imagery, and we have a lot of conversations with people who know the areas that we're looking at, and we, of course, go out and make field observations. When we organize and classify this inventory, we're looking at the public versus the private land. And in the private land, we're particularly interested in the land trust because we want to know, first of all, what public land shoreline do we have? And now we're starting to explore how the land trusts contribute to that. And then we are mapping different attributes of what we're finding with these properties. We're mapping the coastal boundary of the public land and trust land properties. We're mapping access routes as line features and points of entry. And then we also look at the management status of these properties and these features, whether they're informal or formally managed. There are, of course, challenges to all of this. Getting access to data is one. Sometimes it costs money, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the accuracy, we need to, this image here actually shows a problem where sometimes coastal features are mapped a little further inland than they probably should have been. These two examples are showing some inland reaches of streams where the estuary does not quite reach that far inland, and that has to be corrected. We are using Esri ArcGIS. The question is, would it be more publicly accessible once we're finished doing this if we use QGIS? And then we also have to think about how we're going to update it and maintain it. And all of this costs money, of which this work is almost entirely unfunded. So we have some challenges in moving forward with the inventory. In terms of what we're mapping and analyzing, we're looking at the distribution, as I said, of public and quasi-public shoreland, and eventually we'll want to know the total extent and how it is distributed relative to the population and how functional it is. This is an example by one of our students, Antea Fleming, who just graduated recently with a Master of Marine Management. And Antea was particularly interested in the access points in southwestern Nova Scotia and Shelburne County, one of our completed counties. And she was mapping the type and quantity, quality, and distribution, asking questions like how are access points situated on this publicly owned land? Where are they situated related to privately owned land? What are the characteristics of these public access points? And she was inspired by the work from California. And she took this classification that the California Coastal Access Guide provides and applied it to her work in Shelburne County and was able to produce a document, a pamphlet, or a booklet really, of access on public property to the coast. And so I've inserted her reference here at the bottom, and that is accessible now on Dalhousie's research sharing website or space called Dal Space. So that will be available for you to look up when you get the recordings. We can also map and analyze for sensitive habitats. Some of the questions we would ask is how much of our publicly accessible coastline is sensitive habitat and how are the access features and routes located in relation to this sensitive habitat? We can start to explore geomorphologically sensitive shorelines and climate change impacts. And in this example, I'm illustrating a park in Halifax Regional Municipality, our capital region. It's McNabb's Island Provincial Park. And ironically, it's not very accessible, even though it's in the middle of our harbor. There is no public transit available to this island, so you have to get there by private means or join on with a tour. And there are tours offered by different groups. I'm part of a group that actually offers tours to that island. We're part of the Friends of McNabb's Island Society, but it costs money. They're expensive, and it can be prohibitive. This is a classification that was undertaken by the Geological Survey of Canada to classify sensitivity of the coastline all around Canada, actually, but we have a very high quality data set for Nova Scotia. And so what we're looking at here on the island is a section of coastline that's quite sensitive to disturbance from marine impacts. And what we're seeing on the island is an erosion of the walkways, the roadways, the trails around the island on the shoreline. And of course, when you're on an island, this is the shoreline is where you want to go. But this has now been a decommissioned trail. We can no longer use it. And what it has done is actually cut off a loop trail, a large loop trail that we had on the island. So that is quite unfortunate that that's happened. And there's at this point, no plans to relocate that trail. We have to really investigate whether that's even possible. And this is another section that is in fact a breakwater. You can see it's no longer a breakwater really. The waves are crashing up over the breakwater and breaking down the breakwater. And when that happens, and when this breakwater, this is the section we're looking at here, when that disappears, this opens up this whole cove potentially for impacts. Right now, you can see it's relatively low to moderate sensitivity for impacts, but that could change dramatically when this is completely broken down, and it's happening very rapidly. It's happening because of the climate change impacts that we're seeing for this particular park. Other applications that we're beginning to explore include analyzing the types of land use change and development practices that are occurring on private land adjacent to public access, publicly owned access. And this could potentially put that public access at risk if it's very close. We could use this information to guide acquisition or sorry, my slides are not, or easements. Sorry, I'm just trying to get onto my own slides here. Guide strategic acquisition or easements that could be established or negotiated with land trusts, for instance, or landowners, just individual landowners. This could be done to try and offset the losses that we may be experiencing to climate change and development impacts. And also, of course, we'd like to increase access and access equity. Publicly owned coastal fronting property is not evenly distributed around the province. It's concentrated in certain parts of the province, which does mean that people living around, different people in different parts of the province do not have equitable access to this type of shoreland. And then this is how it would then guide an analysis of gaps in the distribution and quality of access. So just because access is there doesn't mean it's necessarily accessible. It can be accessible during certain times of the year and not others. It can be accessible to some who have the means to get there, a car or a boat, and not others. And so we need to be exploring that as well. So the work that you just saw presented, that's all been, most of it has been compiled by a large team of students, as I mentioned before, from our university, Dalhousie University, from the Bachelor of Community Design program, Master of Planning, and Master of Marine Management programs. We call them our inventory team, and it seems to be growing. Every year we get more interest, and some of our students are now joining us as interns through the Ecology Action Center. And you met Lily Hull, and Lily, I'm sorry, I don't have your name added to this list, but I will do that as well. So we're even expanding beyond Dalhousie into other universities, which is great. And so therefore, I'd like to thank you very much. And yeah, I think I've got my time. It's not too bad. So I think I have time to answer questions.
Thank you, Patricia. That was really great, and I've seen this presentation before, but or versions of it, but I learn something new every time, and it's also really great to see the progress being made on the inventory, and I look forward to all of the counties having a nice little red check mark next to them. I would
Yeah.
encourage questions in the chat. I have a couple of questions maybe to get us started. I'm going to leave my camera off just to maintain the strong connection, if you don't mind,
Okay.
if that
I've
works.
turned my camera on, so yeah,
Okay, well,
and
if
stop
you're doing
sharing. Yeah.
all right. I
Let's
also don't
let's
mind.
try and see what happens.
It is nice to see a face, isn't it? Instead of just a blank screen of walls
Yeah.
of names. So I'm curious about some of the groundproofing of the work, of the access points, and I'm also curious about whether or to what extent you're able to identify access by incorporating local or community knowledge in those different
Mhm.
counties.
So the very first project that we did, and this answers the question, it's really important to talk to people. So the very first project we did was in the Halifax Regional Municipality, and Rachel McPhail, who is a Bachelor of Community Design student, developed the methodology based on um, her scan of what was available out there and adapting it to our province. So she first did the mapping based on the available data in the databases that I talked about using the government databases for property ownership, and then she looked at what the databases for the Halifax Regional Municipality provided with respect to things like trails, wharves, slipways, etc. She mapped all of that. And then she spoke with each counselor of a district that had a coastline, and they filled in a lot of blanks. And they also removed things that had been taken out by storms, for example, docks, wharves that were damaged and were since removed, or damaged and were not removed but were dangerous to use. And so it was amazing how much she was able to consolidate that information, plus add new information. There was another one down in Shelburne County, and Hannah can jump in too if she has more information, because we were both supervising Antea's work. But the one that comes to mind that was a real eye-opener for me was Antea discovered that through actually going down to Shelburne County and seeing what was going on, there was a municipal property, coastal property in Shelburne that was up for sale. So that was quite an interesting find. Yeah. And then you go to look for accesses that you thought were there, shoreline trails or cliffside trails, and you discover that they've been eroded away. So it's really keeping up with the inventory is a lot of work, but you do have to be out there in the field, and you can't be everywhere. So having eyes in the field and boots on the ground in the field from community members would be a great contribution, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And I was also going to ask if there was what kind of the uptake from government and communities has been, but I think there's been a lot of uptake already just based on what you're describing. So that's really great.
Um, I would not say that actually. We have to
Okay.
reach out to them for uptake. But we did get invited to present this at the local working group of the Green Shores program, which is operating in Nova Scotia now. It's the local government working group. There are now municipalities within Nova Scotia that are aware of the work. And when we reached out to counselors, or when Rachel did to the counselors in HRM, they were very, very interested in this. Very interested. We do have counselors in the municipalities we've spoken with, also in Lunenburg County, who are very interested in this topic of coastal access, because they are the ones that hear about it all the time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I see a question in the chat. So the question from Sam Knight, when the inventory is complete, are you planning to do any awareness communications or community advocacy to share your findings and use them to encourage change? I bet it would have brought interest.
We sure hope so. We haven't got a strategy for that yet, but we sure would like to work on one. So we don't quite know yet how we're going to do that. Like right now, it's this partnership between Ecology Action Center and Dalhousie University and our students, and it's not even a formal, not necessarily a formal partnership. It's just because we all have this love of coastal access. We're obsessed by it in a way, of coastal access. And we came together around it a couple of years ago, uh, and Nicolas Winkler stepped into the position at EAC and took this up as well. Clearly a kindred spirit, and Hannah too. So we have this core group, but we need to think of the best way to move it forward in a way that it is very accessible in a public facing website of some form. And then I think, yeah, one of the things we're trying to draw, I am listening to all that's being said in this particular session today on ideas on how to make that accessible and get people excited about it. But knowing about the access you have. I mean, I'm talking about public access here on public lands, not on the private lands. That's a whole other story, right? But we do have some, but it doesn't feel like enough. In some places, it isn't even there. So getting people excited about how to grow it will be a really important job of this inventory, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. I don't see any in the chat, and I was wondering, you had mentioned equity and factoring equity into some of the inventory, and I know equity has been a big theme through some of the presentations today, and I'm just wondering
Mhm.
what that looks like in the inventory project.
Yeah, so one of our students 2 years ago was looking at equity in, she took the work that Rachel first did in the Halifax Regional Municipality and was surprised to find that in some, so I back up a little bit more. The province has actually mapped communities. There are many of them in Nova Scotia. I mean, put, boundaries around communities on a map based on sort of historic boundaries and the way that communities define their own boundaries. And these are places that exist. They may be a municipality all by themselves, in which case they'd be very tiny, but it largely exist within other municipalities, which then exist within these counties. And what she found was that there are quite a few of these communities that have coastal, that as a community bound on the coast, but they don't have any coastal access. They don't have that perpendicular access to the shore that then allows them to move, if you're approaching it from the land, along the shoreline in the public realm. So that was a first look at, where is there actually access perpendicular to the shore? And it's very unevenly distributed. Some communities actually have lots. There's plenty of public land in their, not their jurisdiction, but where they define themselves as a community, and others have none whatsoever. Another aspect of access equity was how you get to it. And Taya was starting to look at this as well. Do you have to drive? Or can you take the bus? Or can you walk? Or can you bike? Most of it you need a car to get to if you live outside of a coastal community that has a shoreline. There are a lot of people in Nova Scotia who live, most of us live quite close to the shore, but we don't have our own private shoreline, right? We have to rely on other means to get there. And the equity also extends to, well, there's those who know where to go and those who don't know where to go, right? So looking at this distribution of how newcomers are settling, we have a lot of new arrivals, new residents in the province, and how they are settling around the province and their experiences of trying to find a way to the coast. It was quite interesting. Back in our workshop in PEI, for example, we heard from a few newcomers to Nova Scotia who attended, and they said they were really puzzled, like, how do you get to the coast? Because they don't have that local knowledge, and that's an equity problem.
I am muted. I'm doing one of those. Um, I see we're pretty much at a time. There is another question kind of related to this, and the question is, have you had any meetings with Mi'kmaq First Nations? Access continues to be a concern for those communities as well, and maybe we'll leave that as the last question.
Not yet.
Okay, short answer.
Yeah. No, we have not.
Yeah,
And we do want to, but this is, I think when you start a process like this, inventory like this, you begin with what you understand and then you move out from there. So once we understand better, how our inventory is going to unfold, and as I said, we're dealing, with the public land that's owned by the provincial crown government, mostly in federal government and municipal government. We haven't talked with Mi'kmaq communities about this, but that's definitely something we would want to do.
perfect. Well, we're right on time, so I appreciate your time and the presentation and answering all of my questions and some of the questions in the chat. And yeah, Thank you very much.
Thank you.